Hello and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. Tonight I'm taking a look at Weapons, written and directed by Zach Cregger. If you haven't seen the film yet, don't worry, I will start off spoiler-free, and after that I'll go into a more detailed discussion with spoilers, but I'll give you a clear warning before I switch gears. Weapons arrives with a lot of heat. One gets the sense that the marketing effort was geared towards creating a sense of mystery, though what's actually on screen is steadier and more straightforward, if perhaps a bit tonally uneven at times. If you've seen Barbarian, you of course know that Cregger has a knack for unsettling setups and strange reveals, but Weapons is an altogether different beast. It's more ambitious in scope, messier in execution, and maybe a bit less subtle in its themes. Full disclosure, I liked it, but I didn't love it. I do think it's worth watching with some relatively minor caveats, the main one being if you found yourself swept up by the film's ad campaign like I did, you might want to mitigate your expectations a bit. There's been a recent trend in horror where the marketing ends up being more effective than the movie itself. We saw this last year with Longlegs. There's a kind of game being played now where the less a studio says about a film, the more the film is presumed to be some kind of generational mind-bender akin to Silence of the Lambs or perhaps Seven. Weapons leans into that trend heavily. The trailers tell you almost nothing, the posters are cryptic, the buzz feels artfully engineered. And then the movie starts, and right out the gate, it undermines its own mystique. In particular, I feel that the opening scene is a problem. Rather than showing us the inciting incident, rather than letting the horror unfold in a naturalistic way, we get a sort of exposition dump. We're told that at 2:17 a.m., 17 children all vanished from their beds. They were all in the same class. Their teacher is now under scrutiny. And that's a great premise, but the film skips over what could have been the most emotionally intense material. The parents discovering their kids are gone, the moment some detective realizes this is happening across multiple homes, the community waking up to an impossibly horrific pattern. Instead, we're dropped in media res into the aftermath. And I'm not against starting a movie in the middle of the story, but in this context, it was a jarring choice that ultimately flattened the potential drama. From there, the movie shifts to a sort of multi-perspective format. We've seen this structure before. It's basically an homage to Magnolia, and it is quite self-conscious about this. We'll get into some pretty major spoilers from this point forward, so take that into consideration. The camera moves between seemingly disconnected lives only for certain connections to reveal themselves as the film progresses. This kind of storytelling only works if each narrative thread adds something unique to the whole. But here, a lot of threads feel redundant or worse, perfunctory. There's a cop character who's mostly there to spiral and then die. He doesn't really push the plot forward or offer any real insight. He's just another person who gets caught in the gears. There's also a drug-addicted character who serves primarily as comic relief. I found this choice to be a bit lazy, writing-wise. It felt like a holdover from a different draft of the film or a different film altogether. What's frustrating is that there are two characters who clearly should have been the focus: Justine, the teacher, played by Julia Garner, and Archer, a concerned parent, played by Josh Brolin. Garner gives a sort of tightly wound, guarded performance as someone barely holding it together, while much of the townfolk explicitly blame her for the disappearance of their children. Meanwhile, Josh Brolin brings a sort of haunted masculinity to his role. There's a great moment where he dreams of a house in his neighborhood, and there's a giant assault rifle floating above it, along with the numbers 217, the exact time the children vanished. It's a surreal image and probably one of the most resonant in the film. The assault rifle is, to state the obvious, a weapon, and we'll see over the course of the film, of course, that many different things can be weapons. Cregger's blend of horror and comedy mostly works, but not always. There are scenes that strike the right balance between tension and absurdity, especially when the film leans into the dream logic and its sort of fable-like nature. But other moments feel, to me, like tonal misfires. It's not that you can't have comedy in a horror film, of course. Barbarian did that really well, but Weapons sometimes feels like it's trying to do too much at once, and you can see the exposed seams. That said, the film's thematic resonance is surprisingly strong. The word parasite appears early on, written on a classroom whiteboard, and the movie never really stops underlining that point. Later, we see a nature documentary playing in the background describing a type of fungus that infects ants and controls their behavior. The implication is pretty clear. Something or someone is exerting control over these people in the town and turning them into vessels for their own agenda. Eventually, we learn that the antagonist is a kind of witch, or I guess a folkloric parasite of some kind, who drains the life force from children in order to keep herself alive. She performs elaborate rituals to control people's minds, literally turning them into unfeeling, unthinking weapons. There's a metaphoric significance to this. You start to realize that the film isn't just about supernatural possession, it's about the rituals that already exist in society, rituals that people cling to or guide their behavior, rituals that lead them to harm themselves and others. Justine, for example, turns to alcohol as a means of coping once the town begins to turn against her. It's not framed as some dramatic downfall, it's just another ritual, something she does when she's feeling down. Archer's dream about the rifle implicitly suggests he's a man steeped in gun culture. He seems stuck between sort of protection and violence, or perhaps grief and retribution. The addict character is, of course, a literal servant to his compulsion, and this is clearly the most on-the-nose instance of what I'm talking about. The cop is an alcoholic who ends up cheating on his fiancée with Justine. He slowly begins to unravel due to the weight of his interpersonal problems, and because of that, he assaults the drug addict and abuses his authority. These are familiar behaviors, and at the risk of sounding cynical, it's all pretty well-trodden territory for cinematic horror at this point, but the film treats them not just as character traits, but as symptoms of something deeper. You might say it's like an inability to act outside of what society has conditioned us to do. The rituals aren't just coping mechanisms, they're forms of control and manipulation. And that's where the film really starts to land for me. You start to see that it's not really about a supernatural villain manipulating innocent people. It's about how vulnerable we already are to manipulation in general, how close we are to the edge, how easily our culture, our politics, our addictions, and our trauma can be weaponized. In that sense, the film doesn't really need to explain who or what the villain is exactly. It doesn't matter if she's a witch, a monster, a ghost, a demon. What matters is that she knows how to drain these people until there's nothing left. She understands that they will naturally turn against each other before they become suspicious of her activities. And when she rings the bell, the town falls into a sort of rhythm, almost like this has happened before. The film's decision to make a teacher the target of blame tracks with what we've been seeing around schools lately. Anxiety about curriculum, safety, and identity gets poured onto the most visible adult, the teacher, rather than into a real inquiry of what's actually happening. You can see how this works in practice. The school board meeting turns into a public indictment, and suddenly ordinary behavior is reinterpreted as incriminating. Justine's proximity to the missing kids becomes guilt by association. Her deep-seated care for her students is met with caution by her principal due to the environment of paranoia and reactionary scapegoating in the broader community. This is the ritual the movie keeps circling around. The community moves through a familiar sequence: suspect, isolate, punish. not because the evidence leads there, but rather because the sequence itself is comforting and it requires really no critical thought whatsoever. It's the path of least resistance. Fortunately, Brolin's archer becomes an ally not because he's particularly adept at solving this mystery, but rather because he literally sees her get attacked by one of these weapons, and he realizes that Justine's not really the threat. Together, Archer and Justine figure out the locus of this phenomenon by analyzing the direction these kids are heading in on the Ring camera footage. So they do sort of a triangulation of sorts. Weapons is not a perfect film. Structurally, I feel that it's uneven, and some of the supporting characters kind of feel like dead weight, but thematically, it hits harder than I expected. It's not the enigmatic masterpiece the marketing campaign teased. It's something simpler and, in some ways, maybe more interesting. A story about how we're shaped by forces we don't quite understand, and how easily we can become instruments of terror and harm in somebody else's hands. I recommend the film, even with its flaws. Just don't go in expecting a riddle that only the cleverest viewer can solve. It's more like a grim fairy tale about a town that doesn't realize it's already halfway to the grave before the antagonist really even shows up. That wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so at patreon.com/Nightmare Masterclass. I am expecting to be a little bit more active in the next few months. Fingers crossed. We'll see how much I can get done. But yeah, if you've listened to me this far into the video, thanks for watching and have a good night.